5 dimensions, 10 kingdoms, 9 cities, 1 story. Welcome to Arclanders Assemble, the weekly podcast of the Arcverse. Each week, Team Verse will take you on a guided tour from the streets of Arc to the icebound islands of Celestium. There'll be GMing tips, world-building advice, plus monsters, heroes and lore. Join us for this ride through our 5th edition compatible universe and answer the call to arms, Arclanders Assemble! Hello there again and welcome back to Arclanders Assemble. This is the official podcast of the Arcverse and we've got some awesome stuff for you this week. Here we are once again in the home of spellforging and the 5 dimensions. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's get a little bit of announcements out of the way, a bit of that old housekeeping kind of stuff we have to do, indeed like to do at the start of every podcast. We are going to talk about the news from the Arcverse this week. So, firstly, as of today, our 3rd Kickstarter has launched. This is for our zine, the Arclander. The Arclander is going to be a quarterly zine. It's going to be packed full of campaigns, adventures, and the kind of stuff that's really going to take the big Arcland story moving forward. It's a story we have barely told yet. We've even just hinted at it in The Glassmaker's Dream, which is our adventure in the Book of the Graces, but we've barely scratched the surface. We're going to take that story way forward, and some extraordinary things are going to be happening, mainly involving Earth and dimension-shattering apocalyptic wars and that sort of pretty standard stuff. So you can back the Kickstarter. I'll put the link down in the show notes. But the Kickstarter is ready to roll and will be running now for the month of April. We're halfway there already. We set out like a modest little goal. Some Kickstarters we put the goal a lot higher. We've got print costs in some Kickstarters. We don't in this one. It's a digital only Kickstarter. And so what we're doing really is kind of learning as we go. We're looking at what people look for in zines and how the kind of the format works, and all our best stuff has been a kind of a series of happy accidents, and I'm pretty sure this one will be as well. But it's going to bring to its backers every quarter some amazing maps, some one-shot adventures, an ongoing mega campaign, new character origins, new character classes, and everything that we sit here and dream up of week in, week out at the Arcverse. So yeah, do dive in on that one if you can, and or share it with somebody who's kind of a serial backer. They're always looking for new shiny things to invest in. Anyway, so there's that. And we are now looking towards June. In June, we're going to be at the UK Games Expo. We'll be hanging out there with Britannia Games, and we'll be there for 3 days, 3rd to the 5th of June. Do come and visit us. It'd be great to meet you, great to hang out, and to talk about spellforging, or anything else you fancy, but that's where we're going to be, so we're really looking forward to meeting you there. In addition to that, we are later this year, towards the end of the year, going to be kickstarting our 4th Kickstarter, which will be the Book of the Phantasm. And the Book of the Phantasm is probably our most ambitious project yet. So let's talk a bit about the Phantasm and what it is. Okay, so we know that a little over 300 years ago, a cataclysmic event called the Sundering happened, where the Keeper, the one god of the universe, died and his magical energies flowed back into the world. At about the same time, during this terrible, terrible time of suffering and cataclysm and war and dearth and dirge and all these other dreadful things, people began to experience this terrible, terrible dream, as if a presence was watching them from beyond some kind of curtain, some kind of mirror, into some sort of void, and they began to experience illusions and hallucinations, and a voice calling them, and some vanish forever to a place that we only know as the Phantasm. They're called the Phantasm because it is the product of terrible phantasmical dreams. And the Phantasm turns out to be a place that exists parallel to the Mortal Realm. It is a place that has emerged as a result of the Sundering, a parallel reality where mighty and monstrous powers rule and are very interested in acquiring the energy of fate that player characters take with them. But there are also new character origins that will be emerging from the Phantasm. We don't want to spoiler alert them too much, but we'll talk about at least one of them. The humans that cross over with the power of fate into the Phantasm are converted into a sort of a semi-human breed of witches, which for our purpose in this in the Arcverse means thing that has been kind of broken or hacked or corrupted. So the witches find that mortals with the power of fate, it's useful for spell forging, they find that their fate is hacked open, that somebody tries to kind of extract it. I shan't say who, because again, spoiler alerts. And that energy seeps through their bodies, giving them superhuman abilities, the abilities to fight and defend themselves in all sorts of extraordinary ways. But with great power comes great limitations. We can't have kind of super tank power players wandering all over the place. So our witches, they don't have spellcasting powers, but they have every other sort of kind of useful advantage. And there's some stunning artwork that you can see on our Instagram for the Phantom Witches. And so they're one of the character origins. The other one to talk about that I particularly like are a breed of, or a race of, we don't even use the word race, it's very fascist, an origin called the Ebruin. And the Ebruin are created by one of the great powers of the Phantasm, and their ability is to very quickly grow a sort of almost diamond hard armoured skin over their bodies. They resemble kind of slightly elfin-like characters with dark hair and kind of blue eyes. Excuse me. And when they need to, they can grow diamond hard plates over their skin, which serve as an additional suit of armour. So they make great rogue characters and thief characters, marauders as they are in the Arcverse. So they can do all the sort of the skilled stealthy stuff and then grow armour instead of having to lug it around with them. So very, very handy. And they can even grow a curved blade from their forearm. So I'm really, really looking forward to sharing those with you. And as with all these things, if you just kind of say, well, there's a cool thing and a cool thing and a cool thing, and there isn't like a big interesting story or a big credible story to bind them all together, some big kind of meta myth, then it all just becomes kind of noise, really. So don't worry, we're not just going to dump things in there randomly because we think they're cool. There is an emerging part of the big narrative to come, and we're going to tell you more and more of that story. If you've purchased the Book of the Graces, then you'll know now a little bit more of the big narrative, of what actually happens. Well, you'll know that what people in Aestus understand about the Keeper is very different from what people who have travelled into the Celestial Realm understand. So the standard version of things, if you're somebody who lives in the Arclands or Gotharand or Veska, is that the Keeper created the universe. He's a benign god. He doesn't do anything wrong. He has everyone's best interests at heart, and he was the kind of the repository of all magical power. Now, a series of events appear to have happened, and the Keeper appears to have died, and this is a calamity and a catastrophe. And nobody exactly knows quite why the Keeper has died, but people are pretty certain that he has done. However, if you're a priest of the Eruvian faith, a kind of a rather embattled position by the time of the kind of the beginnings of the Arclands story in the year 295, you're still in a kind of denial. You are in a denial that's perhaps a bit like how people are, people in the church in, say, Great Britain are at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, where they soldier on, but they're declining church audiences and that kind of thing, and people are watching TV instead. In this case, you're in denial that God himself, the Keeper, is dead. Most Eruvians will refuse to accept this. The congregations, of course, they have their suspicions, but the priests, they have to hang on to this article of faith that even if God isn't dead, then he might just be away and coming back at some point. And the reality is that yes, the Keeper has died. If you are somebody that's travelled the Celestial Realm, you might know the following facts. You might know that the Keeper never intended to create the Mortal Realm. It's all a complete accident. And the Keeper never intended to create the majority of the Graces either. That too is a complete accident. And the story goes something like this. So when the Keeper discovered he didn't create the universe, he discovered it. He was drawn to its energies, its primordial chaotic energies. And there were various entities at the beginnings of time called the Astragon. What the Keeper did was he discovered the Astragon, who were able to create as well as they destroyed. They would create, planets, solar systems, all that kind of thing, and then smash into bits because they're kind of anarchic. The Keeper's light drew the Astragon to him, and they thought that he would be their guide and their mentor, but he wasn't. This wasn't to be. What the Keeper did was he created Celestium. He created the Celestial Realm for himself to inhabit out of the energies of the primordial universe. And then, instead of, he created an illusion of a Celestium, and the Astragon flocked into it, only to realise it was a portal into damnation, where they were cast down for eternity into the dark void. And when we eventually get around to writing the Book of Damnation, it's going to be really, really interesting, because the sort of the things that are equivalent to devils and demons down there, they're called the Legion. Well, maybe they're not all that bad. They're just the Astragon, who are, I think, of sort of like a gigantic celestial versions of Ludo from Labyrinth. But we'll get around to that. Anyway, so they were cast into shade, and the Keeper washed his hands of them, and then continued to exist in Celestium, which I think he thought would be the only viable universe. However, he created the Athavanir, who were his sort of titans, and used them to really use their powers to keep damnation in check and to keep Celestium in order, and to keep the universe as it existed into a kind of a tight binary opposition, light and dark, that sort of thing. But where the powers of the Athavanir expanded, they started to create life itself. Now, the problem that the Keeper had is that the Keeper thought that all of the universe was orderable, and he could exist in this kind of sterile, kind of petri dish universe. But life doesn't do that. The universe doesn't do that. Creation doesn't do that. It's far too chaotic, and it's bigger than even the Keeper himself. And so the Tralanvanir, which are the Graces as we understand them, they began to emerge out of kind of shimmering portals of sparkling clouds and that kind of thing. They just appeared, and this was much to the consternation and the horror of the Keeper. The Keeper didn't have a monopoly on creation, and he was very upset by that, and he had to resort to deception. So this is the first of the known deceptions of the Keeper, but I suspect there are probably many more to uncover. The Keeper presented himself to the Trallenvanir as their creator, and he then drew the Athavanir into his lie. The Athavanir, being creatures of almost perfection, began to kind of go slightly insane as a result of having to lie. And think of the kind of the really, really good kid in your class at school, and imagine having basically made them cover up for you, and what that would do to their sanity. And I'm just going out on a limb here, because that good kid might have been you, but it wasn't, was it? So now that the Keeper had told a deception, he had to keep it going. The Keeper had to make sure that he was never found out, and he became intensely suspicious and paranoid of the rather inquiring nature of these new beings, the Trallenvanir. And so he set up his own little secret police, the Shuravi, that looked exactly like the Trallenvanir, and spied upon them. When it looked like a Trallenvanir was getting close to the truth, they would be disappeared in some brutal fashion. And it took many a year, or many an eon, for the Trallenvanir to work out what was happening, and then one of their number, Thaladican, decided that he had the Keeper's number, and began to organise an insurrection against the Keeper, hoping that the Athavanir would help. So Thaladican came within sort of moments of launching his insurrection, and then sort of the universe seemed to step in to help the Keeper, because an enormous threat, some great vast black rolling cloud of horror and destruction, called the Devourer. Nobody knows where it came from, exploded across Celestium, bringing chaos and disruption. And in that final reckoning, the Thaladic Graces and the Phalanx, who are the ones who are loyal to the Keeper, had to band together, along with the Keeper, in order to fight off this terrible, terrible threat. The Keeper also had to send emissaries into Damnation, where the Legion, who had never forgiven the Keeper, now dwelled, to call upon them in order to ally with the Graces to help defeat the Devourer. The last battle of the war was fought in Damnation, and it was a battle in which the Keeper was not mortally but seriously wounded by the Devourer, and yet the Devourer itself was conquered and trapped, and seemed to vanish. Its whereabouts will be revealed at a later date, but as to all intents and purposes it was vanquished and banished. Because the final battle happened in Damnation, the Keeper cut a deal with the Legion, and as the Keeper's loyal Graces left Damnation, the portals began to close, and the rebel Graces, Thaladican Graces, were trapped there and destroyed or enslaved by the forces of Damnation. So the Keeper turned out to be a thoroughly duplicitous god, a god that had every manner of human flaw, from vanity to dishonesty to jealousy to pride, all the things that really make human beings the dreadful creatures that they often turn out to be. And after this, the Mortal Realm emerged. The Mortal Realm seems to be a kind of a byproduct of the Devourer War, and the Keeper now wounded and holed up in Celestium, wanted to use the Graces in order to control the Mortal Realm. So some of the Thaladic Graces escaped the Mortal Realm and hid in the world of Hermia, which is the world where Aestis, our continent in question, is based. And the mortal life that was there began to sort of seemingly emerge spontaneously, and they've been there right from the beginnings of these places, of planets being barren rocks to having weather systems and vegetation, and then insect and fish and mammal life and all this kind of stuff, until there are human civilizations emerge and non-human civilizations. And all throughout this time, they've hidden from the Phalanx Graces and from the Shuravi. But in both cases, the Phalanx and the Shuravi came to the Mortal Realm in order to prevent the Thaladic Graces using it as a power base to challenge the Keeper. And it was the Shuravi and the Phalanx Graces that created essentially human civilization, and non-human civilizations as well. They create institutions such as religion and slavery and debt and every other means of kind of crushing the imagination and suborning the will in order to control mortals, and not out of any interest in mortals or love for them. Mortals were kind of convinced that there was some sort of afterlife type deal there. There isn't, by the way, spoiler alert. And that the Keeper had their best interests. And this was all designed to prevent them from being a chess piece that the Thaladic Graces could use. The Keeper, as he went into decline, was confronted by another challenge. An entity known as Levanto came to the Celestial Realm and turned out to be far more powerful than the Keeper, and is there simply to examine all known realities. Is what Levanto does. He's not a god as we might understand it, but just an entity of supreme power. And this led the Keeper to act in ever more desperate ways in order to impress his Phalanx Graces. It was only when one of the Phalanx Graces, Etranakul, became sort of questionable to the Keeper. Her secret desires to live a mortal life and to face death, which to her was the ultimate truth, are understood by the Keeper, and she's dragged before him in chains. And her lover, or her unrequited lover, Ikantu, called upon the Phalanx, who were again starting to become a bit dubious of the Keeper, and the Athvenir to save her. And the combination of the Athvenir and the Phalanx and the Keeper's injuries from the Devourer War led to the Sundering, where the Keeper is destroyed and Celestium is devastated. It ceases to be a lovely, warm, kind of rather Mediterranean-looking heaven. It becomes a cold, barren waste instead, or at least for our purposes, one that is rapidly cooling down over time. By the time human beings begin to inhabit the Celestial Realm, and they'd started to inhabit it bit by bit, the Graces had sort of taken them up there for sort of instructional lessons in sort of how to do civilization, and human civilizations had endured in the Celestial Realm on these floating islands called Lossivar. By that time, the weather is becoming much more inclement, and by the time that we start our adventures in the Celestial Realm, the place is a kind of there is warmth and light at its heart, but as you move outwards from the light of the Keeper, this great star in the heart of Celestium, it becomes progressively colder and more miserable and more kind of windswept and less habitable. And that's obviously where monsters hang out. So that's the potted history of the celestial realm. And the reason why I'm telling you that today is because everything that we will kind of talk about here in the future is based on this kind of primary understanding of the flaw in the universe. The idea that in sort of Judeo-Christian religion, the flaw in the universe is a kind of the fall of man. It's man's fault. Man, Adam and Eve, listened to that serpent and bit the apple and became aware of themselves and all embarrassed about nakedness and all that kind of stuff. In this case, it's about the fall of God. God being as imperfect and as flawed as the rest of us. And what does that tell us about the universe? Well, the universes in the Arcverse aren't necessarily the products of perfect gods. They're kind of balls of energy that these godlike entities come across and try to do their best with, and fail often with kind of fairly calamitous results. And that just makes things more interesting, I think. Anyway, so park that one. We're going to come back to that repeatedly. I'll be talking a lot about lore and that kind of thing as we go on to this podcast. We're going to move on to our next segment of this week, which is all about world building. And last week, if you recall, I think we were talking about cyber vampires in space, and that was simply a way of illustrating about getting your big and your little concepts in order, and making sure that kind of coherence rules. Why do we need to do that? Why do we have to have things to be coherent? Well, because they need to make some sort of sense most of the time. People will not want to read your stuff or enjoy your stuff if we're in a system where nothing kind of makes any fixed sense. It's all kind of chaotic. I guess what I want to move on from there to talk about is this old film theory of kind of genre. How do we navigate a particular genre? Well, it has to have conventions in it. But the good thing about these conventions is that they can kind of be inverted. So let's take high fantasy. Okay, we know about the conventions of high fantasy from Tolkien and from things like that, and from everything that D&D has done for the last sort of 40 odd years. In high fantasy, we know that the setting is normally around the Middle Ages. We know the setting involves a variety of different sorts of creatures. They're normally the sorts of the things that were in Lord of the Rings. There are halflings or hobbits, and there are elves, there are dwarves. And these are big signs, just as that we know kind of what we're buying, just as kind of golden arches suggest that there's a hamburger nearby. They're a kind of a powerful and useful shorthand. And you know what? People like that. They really do. There are innumerable people on Twitter who will go, oh my goodness, why does everything have to be so predictable and cliched? Well, because people like predictability and cliches, and because cliches are shorthand for things. Now, all the time people are turning these conventions on their heads. People were doing this back in the early years of D&D. There was a long lost D&D supplement about a kind of a hollow earth in which you go inside the earth and it's just a kind of a hollow. You're almost like inside the football, and in there you get elves, the urban elves and sort of woodland dwarves, for example, which have, and you have elves that are kind of like gold and diamonds and mead and are slightly bad-tempered and all this kind of cliched stuff, and dwarves that are sort of wise and wistful and wander through the glades and recite poems and look in beautiful pools and that kind of stuff. Okay, so far so obvious. But let's talk about the conventions of your world. Your world will be to some extent recognisable through conventions, but those conventions, don't worry, it doesn't mean you have to stick to some sort of formulaic nonsense. I mean, who ultimately wants to do something that's been done for about 100 years? you can play with those conventions, mess with them, invert them, move them around, but there has to be a certain kind of logic to it all, or once again we wind up with this kind of sort of messy stuff. And you can have that if you want, but great world building will not come of that by and large, I don't think. Anyway, if you want to write into the comments or on the Twitter or something like that, if this is a matter for debate. But let's say that we're taking medieval fantasy, okay, and we want to mess with the fundamentals of it. Okay, so in Arclands, for example, I'm bored with dragons. There's nothing more interesting to say about dragons, okay? Dragons have been done to death. Dragonlance, Game of Thrones, it did it to death. So we decided to dispense with them. Surely it is possible to create the uber monster without having dragons. And if I get to a point where I think, now that's an interesting thing to say about dragons, then I'll probably do something with it. But we took out that convention. For example, we introduced spell forging, where which not only is just that part of the mechanic system, but it's woven into the lore of the world. So we have spell forgers are places where magic is created. So magic isn't learned by people in long robes with long beards in magical towers and magical Hogwarts sort of places, and there's none of that either. This kind of ubiquity of magic, everything down to magic toasters, we don't have that. So we started to remove some of the conventions, and we started to play with some of the conventions. So this is just a very simple way of kind of illustrating that. How could you play with conventions? Well, let's say that we're taking another setting. Let's say that we're doing, say, cyberpunk. Okay, we know we exist in dark, gritty, grim cities where the future is essentially Blade Runner. There are flying cars. It rains all the time, and people have cybernetic limbs. Okay, what if none of those things are happening? What if instead of having cyberpunk, where everything is highly technological, what if you have a dark future where you have the darkness but not much of the future? Well, there you get Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and that's going to be a pretty miserable existence too. There's nothing very fun about that. Or what if you take cyberpunk out of the city and say basically, okay, well, let's imagine that the city's died. Let's imagine that places like Los Angeles in 2017 or whatever, or 2049, there's some big EMP pulse, and because that's where all the tech stuff is. The city's died, and most of humanity is now moving around. Oh, this is interesting, isn't it? So you have nomads in cyberpunk, but what if everyone's a kind of nomad? So now we're sort of taking the convention and stretching it. The cities you don't go into. The cities might have fallen to booster gangs, or maybe something even worse. Maybe there's been something bioengineered there. Some sort of, I don't want to go down the route of undead. I was talking about them last week. Some giant sort of cyborgy reptile type deal. But there's a very good reason for not going into the cities. And so here we got one of the kind of the fundamentals, the core big kind of tectonic plate level concepts. Okay, so then you have the mid-level concept, because you can't go into the city, because we mess with that convention now. Cities aren't sort of places of high technology; they're dead places. So what does that mean? Well, does everyone have to live in towns? Maybe there are towns ringed around the cities that people are just far enough away from the horrible nasties. Or maybe towns move themselves. Maybe we've reached a level of technology and nomadry that entire towns are mobile, and so you've got either movable towns. Now we're getting into that Mortal Engines type thing, but I don't want to go down the steampunk route. Don't get me started on steampunk. Or something kind of like that. Towns on massive, there's massive things that they move the kind of Challenger shuttle around with at Cape Canaveral. Towns built on those. And you might think, well, our town hasn't got enough fuel, enough water, enough anything. We need to drive it to like Wisconsin in order to sort of do stuff over there, and the town itself on wheels might be built on a huge mining platform. So you go, you know that there's going to be some oil somewhere or something useful in the ground. You go and drill, and that might be how it works. So now we've got roller punk. Yeah, that I've just invented it, or driller punk. And you might also think, well, is the surface the best place to be? It might be that also below the surface is that's kind of where things are at. You know, people might have gone under the ground because it's warmer, and so there might be sort of equivalent sorts of civilizations under the earth going around in gigantic great machines rolling around and stuff like that. So again, you know, you mess with one convention and then you put your middle ranking concepts on top of that, and hey presto, what do you got? Something really quite crazy. And then small concepts. Well, who lives in these movable platforms? Are they like little dictatorships? Are they little movable democracies? Are there federations of movable towns that get together and fight battles in order to conquer other ones? Do these movable towns sort of settle down for part of the year? Do they go on the sea? Are they kind of sea arcologies that move around? Or can you put one in the atmosphere? You know, like a floating sort of base in the sky. So you would wonder what sorts of people live there. What's it like to be so rootless? What's it like to stand on the top of one of these things and watch it drive across the Great Plains? How do you enforce problems around scarcity, law and order? Are there, for people that do bad things on these things, are there prisons? Do you just chuck them over the side and leave them to die in the desert? Is there fun on these things? Do they have like a cross-channel ferry? Is there like a little cinema and a karaoke? I mean, these are the kind of the small order concepts. Do you fly like reconnaissance jets from them and helicopters and AVs and things in order to scout out the countryside? So would your PCs be a kind of a scout party from one of these things? And so there you go. And you can take your mega order concepts that you've derived through subverting the genre in a different direction. About the towns and cities, who did that? You know, who did that? Maybe, you know, the idea that, well, it's America and maybe it was one of America's enemies in the world that did it. Well, yawn. What if nobody knows who did it? Again, so let's sort of mess with this a bit. What if it was an EMP pulse from a satellite that had gone rogue and sort of kind of gone dark for a while and then kind of re-emerged and started to attack Earth? Maybe it's some kind of alien intelligence or an artificial intelligence. Maybe there's this kind of thing out in the atmosphere called the shadow or the avatar or the whatever that everyone's supremely frightened of, and everyone is kind of constantly looking to the skies to see if it's coming over, and it might not have done anything for a while, but it's kind of chilling. So the reason I mention that is because if you can throw a wild card in there that even you don't know the answer to, then interesting things will abound. In some ways it's important that you don't know the answer. If you know the answer to everything you write will become like dry Weetabix. There will be no mystery, no spark, no spontaneity, no confusion, no mental battle to go, oh crikey, how are we going to pull that together? It will become dull. So today's world building takeaway: mess with your conventions. You don't have to have the conventions of the genre absolutely fixed. You have to have some conventions, because otherwise it just becomes this big kind of post-structural sea of madness, and that is not what we're really looking for here. but flip those conventions, invert them, subvert them, and change them around, and make sure that you don't necessarily have to do anything formulaic, and then see how that creates the big order concepts in the world. Sometimes if you write down your big order concepts, you can kind of park them for a while. You don't have to then write all the other stuff. You can go away, think about it, and go, well, how would that big concept create these middle order things like civilizations and settlements and towns and cities and even nations? How would that do that? And then gradually over time, and it's the little order concepts that you will spend most of your time writing about. They take a long time, but this is part of the joy of it all. Anyway, okay, so let's just park that there. So today we've looked at a bit to do with the Book of the Graces and the Book of the Phantasm, and we've focused a bit on world building, and so now what we are going to do is talk a little bit about history. Okay, so if you're world building, let's go back to the medieval fantasy genre, and you want to make something that's roughly analogous to medieval Europe. Now, I'm not saying you should do something that's roughly analogous to medieval Europe, because medieval Byzantium or Persia or India or China or Japan are all kind of amazing places to situate an adventure, but I'm just going with low-hanging fruit here. We'll talk about medieval Europe now. And you want to kind of create some notion of what society would be like. Okay, so you've got castles, you've got knights, you've got something that sort of kind of looks like feudalism, and so the question you might be wondering, okay, so well, what sorts of things do people believe? What is the kind of the order of life? Okay, well, if we're going to let's start with looking actually at medieval Europe, where people existed in a thing called Christendom. So the way in which people navigated the world was through Christianity, and before the Reformation, the centre of Christianity was the papacy. It was in Rome, and the great spiritual lord of all things was the Pope, and the temporal lord of all things in your neighbourhood would have been the king or a prince who ruled you. Why do you not get in, say, the 13th century some kind of republican, democratic movement emerging? Well, you get uprisings. I mean, in the 14th century, you get things like the Peasants' Revolt. Peasants' Revolt. It nearly was a result, but Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Where some quite sophisticated ideas about freedom and equality are articulated. Why do you not get a democratic revolution emerging and modern democratic states emerging? It's not because people weren't capable of it. It's because the central idea that dominates people's ideas of themselves, of nature, of social hierarchy, of even time and space itself, is Christianity. So when you have this central organising concept, and also mass illiteracy, so people can't read, they can't access other sources of information because you haven't had a printing revolution either, then you're going to have difficulties organising people politically. People can, peasants periodically throughout the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries get very angry, and there are uprisings and things like that, normally crushed by the state. But in terms of actually articulating the sorts of things that Thomas Paine comes out with during the American and French revolutions, you don't get that. If you want to set your world at a period in time of mass literacy, well, it's not going to be the wise old wizards that are capable of reading things. They might be able to read magic scrolls, But people can read non-magic scrolls. They can read things all around town. They can read, and if there's printing, they can buy books relatively cheaply and read them and educate themselves and have different ideas about the world. Mass printing, mass literacy, does not make for necessarily stable societies. And if you want to do something interesting, you could create a society where printing has begun, where things like the Gutenberg press have been created, just on the cusp of the Reformation, and things are starting to change, and you might have people that are starting. You might be able to have a magical Reformation. That would be good, wouldn't it? Where all of a sudden ideas about magic are starting to disseminate in ways that they've never done before, and kings and emperors get very upset and they want to hold on to these sorts of things and stop people getting hold of them, and established structures of power begin to crumble, as happened during the Reformation. So I guess the circulation of ideas has little to do with intellect. I don't think people 1,000 years ago were necessarily any more intellectually, or less intellectually capable than we are. There's not much evidence to support that. But certainly they didn't have the technologies of knowledge. They didn't have systems of knowledge that we do. We now have the internet, which is causing havoc around the world for good and ill, and the historians in 50 years' time will probably look at this in the same way that people did during the 30 Years' War, of look at the numbers of websites visited and Twitters done and all that kind of stuff, and how that and the increase in that changes people's perceptions of reality, or even confuses people's perceptions of reality, as is so often the case. So here's a question for you. What are the information settings in your society? How do people know things? Do people know things through a kind of a wistful bard visiting the village? Do people know things because there are libraries? Do people know things because there are other means of technology, magical means of technology? Do people know things because there is a kind of telegraph? Again, that speeded up the world immeasurably. Do people know things because they are connected psychically or cybernetically? And in terms of telegraph as well, it's always worth mentioning that revolutions in the perceptions that human beings had about the world in the 19th century happened when they started to be able to travel faster than they could walk or ride a horse. And the age of steam power suddenly made the world both smaller for people and larger. People could travel the length and breadth of the country, and it gave them a sense of being a national citizen as opposed to being a local one. And again, you might find, if you're writing a medieval fantasy world, that people don't equate to themselves as being national citizens, because for a lot of the time people didn't. They saw themselves as being particularly parochial. If you were to go even as late as 19th century Russia to somebody in the middle of Russia and say, well, where are you from? They would normally say, I'm from here. Not, I am a Russian and I have this big sense of being a Russian national citizen, because lots of them didn't. So what are the information settings on your world? What is the availability of experience to the people in your world? Do they get to travel? Do they get to move around a lot? The thing about, setting things in a medieval fantasy is, if everything was going to be hyper-realistic, people would, for the 90% of the adventure, be working on the land, and then the king might say, well, we're going to have to go to Jerusalem to lead some crusades or something, some other ridiculous, or have a war with France. And then you'd go and do that, and it would be short and brutal, and probably lots of people would die, but probably quite exciting as well. So people in the Middle Ages were actually highly static. There were some people that did cattle droving, some people that went around selling things, and some people that were part of the growing globalisation of trade. But for most people, you stay where you're born. Okay, so a little bit of history lesson there. I am a history teacher, by the way, so full fact. So I hope that's kind of useful in sort of orienting your thoughts about more complex ideas around world building. And if you can do that sort of stuff, then everything else sort of has a kind of realistic detail and depth and makes a kind of sense. But anyway, I'm going on. So in the show notes you will find all the links to all the Arcland stuff. Do check it out. Please check out our Kickstarter. We would love for you, obviously, to back our the Arclander, but that's because we have got a ton of really amazing things to share with you and to give you as a result. It's not just it is quid pro quo. It really is. And we'll be back next week when I'll talk more about the Arcverse, more about random ideas about world building, and maybe a bit more history. Who knows? So thanks so much for listening, and forge your power, and I'll catch you on the next Arclanders Assemble. Bye bye. If you enjoyed Arclanders Assemble, remember to subscribe to this podcast and share it with your friends, or give us a shout out. We'll need an army to stop the darkness that's coming. You can find us on Discord, World Anvil, YouTube, Twitter, DriveThruRPG and Kickstarter, and the links are available in the show notes. Catch next week's episode on iTunes, Spotify and all good pod hosters, and come and find us on social media. We'd love your feedback.